Okay, so let's be clear here. RTX 5080 offers superior value to the outgoing 4080 Super. The Founders Edition, at least, will be released at the same price point, 1,000 of your US bucks. It's a bit faster than the 4080 Super and has support for DLSS 4 multi-frame generation. And so, as a replacement for the 4080 Super, it's perfectly fine, right? Certainly in a much better place than the RTX 4080 back in 2022, which actually seemed to represent worse value than the 4090. However, there will be some level of disappointment in what Nvidia has delivered here. Many will be thinking back to the times where the new 80 class card beat the last generation flagship, like GTX 980 versus 780 Ti, or especially 3080 versus 2080 Ti. A step change in performance for the money there, which this definitely isn't. 5080 is not as fast as a 4090 by quite some margin, but it's a good chunk cheaper. 5090, it leaves the 5080 for dust. Now, there's going to be variance on a game-by-game basis that is quite important, but let's lay down some baseline combined figures based on our benchmarks. 5080 versus 5090. It should come as no surprise that we're looking at a yawning chasm in terms of performance. There's simply no comparison. According to our aggregated results, 5080 has around 77% of the performance of the 5090 at 4K resolution, rising to 83% of 4090 throughput. Judged by the prices of those cards, a $1,000 5080 looks okay. But compared to the outgoing 4080 Super that sold at the same price, 5080 is around 14% faster than a 4080 Super, so not a revelatory jump there. So in effect then, RTX 5080, judged without the merits of new DLSS features, is kind of like a 4080 Super Ti, if you like. In terms of baseline operation, it's a refined version of the existing product. Does that tell the full story though? I guess for many it will, but there is something else about 4080 upwards that is compelling. If you're gaming at 4K resolution, this is the place to be if you're interested in 4K path tracing without spending, $1,600 or $2,000. In that sense then, I see it as a threshold product. And yeah, multi-frame gen is certainly useful here. Okay, so we're reviewing the Founders Edition card today, and similar to the RTX 5090, you're getting a svelte, beautifully rendered 2-slot design. HDMI 2.1 on the back there, paired with 3 DisplayPort 2.1s. It's the usual 12-volt high-power connection at the top there, as established by 40 series. Looking at specs, I've stacked up 5080 to 5090, 4090 and 4080 Super. CUDA core count and die size indicate just how close the 5080 is to the 4080 Super. The core spec points there are very, very similar, and we're on the same process node, of course. Where there are variations, it comes down to power and bandwidth. 5080 moves up to 360 watts versus the 4080 Super's 320. The use of GDDR7 for 960 gigabytes per second of bandwidth means there's a 30% uplift there compared to the outgoing card. What is pretty clear, however, is that the new GB203 design is tiny compared to the GB202 in 5090. It's like GB202 has been cut in half, really. Almost half the CUDA cores, half the memory controllers. Power consumption massively reduced, while boost clock goes up just over 200 MHz. Typically, the bigger the chip, the less efficient it is, so while 5090 will be faster, it's not going to be twice as fast. Comparisons against 4090 are also interesting. Far fewer CUDA cores, but slightly higher clocks and only a small reduction in bandwidth, despite the memory interface reduction. Let's see how some of those crucial spec points bear out in actual gaming workloads. Looking at Alan Wake 2 on high settings with low RT because every other setting is using path tracing, well, our GPUs here have very similar clock speeds, the exception being the vast 5090 processor, which has to clock a little lower. RTX 5080 has 74% of the 5090's performance here, and is using 62% of the power. Compared to the outgoing 4080 Super, 5080 is 15% faster, but draws only 6% more power. There's broad equivalence in performance and power between 5080 and 4090, interestingly enough. The 5080 has 82% of 4090 performance, using 78% of the power. I should say that for those who heard my comments in the 5090 review about odd stuttering, We received a driver update the day before embargo that does address this issue. A bit inconvenient, but these benches come from that driver and there is improvement. Looking now at Hitman World of Assassination, the outlook on boost clocks remains pretty much unchanged from Alan Wake 2. In terms of power versus performance, the new 5080 has 59% of 5090's frame rate output for 62% of its consumption. While looking at 4080 Super, the new offering has an 11 percentage point performance advantage for 11% more consumption. Effective parity really in efficiency terms. And finally, looking at the 4090 comparison, the 5080 has 77% of the old flagship's performance and uses 81% of the power, about 330 watts. One final example here, F124 maxed out at 4K resolution with all RT features enabled, and there are many of those RT features. RTX 5080 here delivers 77% of the 5090's performance and does so for around 80% of the power. Looking to the last gen counterpart, 5080 is 11% faster than 4080 Super, using 5% more power, and finally up against 4090, 5080 offers 79% of the performance for 79% of the power. I can guess you can look at these results in two ways. On the one hand, the 40 series cards were always super efficient. 50 series on Blackwell, well, the fact that we're still on the same 4nm process node means we're never going to get huge boosts to efficiency, but we're on par or a touch better than 4080 Super depending on the workload, with similar efficiency numbers to the 4090. Okay, so benchmarks. Well, I'll pick out some highlights here, but I would recommend you check out my review on Eurogamer.net once it's complete and posted. There you'll find 5080 stacked up against every card seen here today, along with many others. 16 in total, encompassing pretty much every Nvidia and AMD card in this class, or close to it, released since 2018. Oh, and I added RX 6700 10GB there too, the closest GPU in the PC space to the PS5 GPU. This gives you some idea of how far beyond the mainstream the 80 class cards truly are. 2160p, 1440p and 1080p resolutions too, but I'm just focusing on 4K in this review. There's a ton of data to mine then, but as it mostly tells you much the same thing, I'll restrain myself to highlights in this video review. So let's start with some stats that proved underwhelming. Avatar Frontiers of Pandora delivered smaller than expected gains with 5090 versus 4090. And I'm seeing the same thing here with 5080 versus 4080 Super with just a 6.44 percentage point boost. This gives the 4090 a considerable 27 percentage point lead over 5080, with 5090 outscoring 5080 by 54%. So once again, two ways of looking at this. 5080 is a lot cheaper than either of those flagship cards, but at the same time, there's a big gap now between 80 and 90 class performance. If the concept of a user upgrading from a 4080 or 4080 Super seems unlikely, which is fair enough I guess, let's look at prior 80 class cards going back to 2018's 2080. And yeah, check out the frame time graph here. Far more so than the FPS graph, you're seeing the evolutionary jumps in performance over the last 6 to 7 years. RTX 3080 was a phenomenon, with a gigantic leap over the 2080 and at the same price. That's a doubling of performance in this case. 3080 to 4080, a 37% increase in frame rate there, but this time with a gigantic price premium. And now 4080 non-super to 5080, 9% increase in performance there at much the same price. Comparing 3080 to 5080, there's a 50% increase in performance, so definitely worth having, but the price is $300 heavier. We'll talk about value later on, but spoilers, RTX 5080 does offer more value, but not that much more, just over 4 years later. Alan Wake 2 is next on high settings with low RT. As I said, anything higher than that and we're in past-facing territory, but reflections and transparency reflections are certainly nice to have. The 5080 sits at an interesting point here. 4090 is faster, but it's only around 20% faster while costing a whole lot more relatively. RTX 5090 steams ahead, however, with a 63 percentage point lead. Again, though, it's costing a lot more than the relative cost, $1,633. There's a reasonable, if not exactly spectacular gain over 4080 Super, 15.6%. That's just ahead of the overall average. Mapping everything to prior Gen 80 class cards, 2080 is completely overwhelmed here, so there's a 3.7x performance increase, while the new card is 63% ahead of the epoch-making 3080. And against the non-Super 4080, 18 points clear. So yeah, in terms of upgrade paths, if you're on Turing or Ampere, this is worth considering, well, depending on how far ahead the upcoming $750 5070 Ti will be, of course. Cyberpunk 2077 in Psycho RT mode. Yes, we'll be talking about path tracing in a bit. So the 5080 here is delivering a 13-point uplift over 4080 Super. Okay, so 13%. Not exactly a big deal, but certainly an improvement over Avatar's 6.44%. Thing is, we have the 5090 here delivering a 59% performance increase over 5080 on these tests, while the 4090 is about 22 points ahead. Let's look back now at prior 80 class cards. A 15-point lead for the 5080 over the non-Super 4080, rising to 58% against RTX 3080. You're paying 43% more for your 80 class card than you did back in 2020. Value hasn't changed that much, but it is still better, I guess. And at this point, I guess that on a more general economic level, we can't really rule out the fact that we've just gone through a massive inflationary bubble. Dying Light 2 on high RT does have some decent scaling on Blackwell, with another performance bump over 4080 Super that trends higher than elsewhere. I'm clocking a 17.6% increase for 5080 over 4080 Super, meaning the RTX 4090 is quote-unquote only 20 points ahead. If Dying Light does like Blackwell, though, that means big things for 5090. The 5090 is 67 points clear of 5080. Looking at gen on gen on gen on gen, 5080 is basically 4 times faster than 2080. It's 59% clear of 3080 and almost 20% faster than the non-Super 4080. F124 next. It's about 11% clear overall versus 4080 Super in this test, which by extension sees 4090 offering up a 26-point lead over the new card, rising to a whopping 65% from 5090 versus 5080. Now looking back at the prior 80 class offerings, again we're 4 times faster than 2080, which is hamstrung against the other cards in terms of compute power and limited VRAM, whilst the 5080 is 50% faster than a 3080. Prime upgrade territory, I'd say, while the new card is about 13 points clear of the non-Super 4080. Let's move on to Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, where I saw oft-friend lackluster results from the 5090. But 5080 seems to move into a bit more of a sweet spot, I'd say. So let's take a look at that. 5090 is only 45% faster than 5080. Obviously, that's noticeable, but it is lower than many of my other results. By extension, 4090 is just 18 points ahead of 5080. Meanwhile, comparing the new card against its immediate predecessor, I see a 10% boost, so not exactly revelatory. It trends under the average. This is on supreme settings, but not with path tracing, I should add. Looking at prior generation 80 class offerings, even with VRAM pool settings adjusted to high rather than supreme, the 2080 isn't even at the races, while there's a 61% increase in performance against 3080, which again has texture settings dropped to high just to get it running, something I think the game should be doing itself, similar to the way Avatar operates. 4080 and 4080 Super perform identically here, so again a 10-point lead for the 5080. A Plague Tale Requiem now, fully armed and operational at max settings, RT shadows on. This one saw prodigious leaps from 4090 to 5090, and I suspected this may be down to the surfeit of memory bandwidth the new flagship has, which the 5080 kinda doesn't. With that in mind, it's no surprise to see the 5090 a full 70 percentage points clear of the 5080. 70%. This drops to around 25% comparing 4090 to 5080, with a new card about 15% clear of 4080 Super. Looking at old 80 class cards with relatively meager compute power and nowhere near enough VRAM, the 2080 moves into slideshow mode. But 3080 with 10 gigs seems to hold on. 5080 is 60% ahead though in performance terms, dropping to 18 points clear against the non-Super 4080. So I think you get the trend now, but let's move on to some non-RT benchmarks. And when I say non-RT, what I mean is tests that don't require hardware accelerated ray tracing. The concept of ray tracing now is so established that Unreal Engine 5, for example, has software lumen RT global illumination. So we're not completely getting away from RT here. Let's look at a couple of UE5 games, kicking off with the demanding Black Myth Wukong. This one's actually interesting as the 4090, 5090 flagships perform comparatively poorly against the 5080, which in turn runs a touch faster versus 4080's Super. So yeah, the new card is 15 points clear of 4080 Super, but the 4090, actually it's only 13 points ahead of the new Nvidia offering. Meanwhile, the 5090 is hardly scintillating in its performance uplift. Yes, it's the fastest card, but in this area of the game, it's just an average 41% faster than 5080. Looking at prior 80 class cards, BMW isn't especially impactful on VRAM, which explains perhaps why the 4x differential seen elsewhere between 5080 and 2080 is quote-unquote only 3x here. However, the new card beats 3080 by 61%, slightly above the usual trend. 4080 and 4080 Super are basically interchangeable here, where we see a 16-point advantage for the Blackwell-powered 5080. Some interesting performance differentials here with Hellblade 2, another advanced game running on UE5. 5090 is still streets ahead with a 49-point lead over 5080, but here in this content, I'm only seeing a minor 16 percentage point lead for the 4090 over the 5080, and we're 12 points clear of the 4080 Super. Those prior gen comparisons are arguably more useful though for those considering an upgrade, where we find that there's an almost 6 times multiplier over 2080, which seems to be a VRAM based disaster area before we even factor in compute. 5080 is 50% ahead of 3080 and the new card is 14% ahead of the vanilla non-super 4080. Finally, Forza Horizon 5, and this game has always been a bit strange, kind of weird. Doesn't get anywhere near to the power limits of the GPU, certainly on 40 and 50 series GPUs, which does suggest underutilization. And yet at 4K extreme settings with 8x MSAA, can't really be CPU limited, right? And here my tests produce bizarre results to say the least. RTX 4090 is just 3.5% faster than the 5080, which is kind of shocking. And more shocking still to see the 5090 delivering just 32% more performance. Meanwhile, the gen-on-gen gains are huge compared to the trend, a 21.5% increase over 4080 Super. If there's an underutilization issue here, 5080 seems to sit in a sweet spot where it's seemingly less impacted. Curious stuff. With that in mind, maybe there are knock-on effects with prior generation cards. 30 series and back don't actually seem to have this underutilization issue. We do seem to be VRAM limited on 2080, partly explaining a 4.3 times performance boost for 5080, and we're about 61 points clear of 3080. Again, this would suggest to me a pretty good upgrade path. A 24-point lead against 4080 non-super, well, that's relatively prodigious compared to some of the other results we've seen. So look, I've aggregated all the data points and here's how all the performance differentials come out. I don't really trust the 4K results here, as at 1440p and 1080p, you're going to be influenced by CPU limitations. I used 9800X3D with 6000 megatransfers per second CL30 DDR5 from Corsair, but even so, those resolutions will be bottlenecked. On average, the 5090 56% ahead of 5080, 4090 is 20% clear. My results show an average 14 percentage point advantage for 5080 over 4080 Super, with a 57 percentage point advantage over the 3080. However, I do feel that while the 3080 comparison is a good indicator of a general across-the-board increase to performance, I think the comparisons between 5080 and 4090, 5090 do not fully represent how vast the differences can be on a per-game basis. But if you want your at-a-glance look, there it is. Okay, so let's move on to path tracing and DLSS 4 and multi-frame generation. So it's my belief that while 90 class cards deliver stupendous performance and should basically run anything, 80 class should offer a more affordable alternative that still delivers the ability to run those super high-end experiences, and to get smoother gameplay, multi-frame generation will obviously be factored in. There's another interesting question to answer too. Nvidia made the claim that RTX 5070 offers 4090 performance, but to what extent can the 5080 do it? That's going to be interesting, right? Because if the 5080 can't do it, what are the chances of the 5070 doing it? Anyway, we've got limited access to path trace games in the review period, so I would have loved to have factored in Indiana Jones and Black Myth Wukong, but for now, Cyberpunk and Alan Wake 2 it is. And let's begin with Cyberpunk 2077. In this streaming test, RTX 5080 averages a mere 22.9 frames per second in native 4K rendering with a 75 millisecond latency, which is not great, right? Compare and contrast with 4X multi-frame gen, which averages at 186.5 frames per second with a 50.93 millisecond lag. Switching over from native resolution stats there in the graphing to DLSS performance mode, super resolution, frame rate averages at 61.3 frames per second, a good base point for frame generation with a 36.5 millisecond latency. So there's a 14.4 millisecond hit to input lag in exchange for a 3x increase to fluidity. It's interesting to see that the circa 10 millisecond lag differential on 5090 increases by around 4 milliseconds on 5080. 10 milliseconds plays 14. Kind of makes sense, right? Fewer tensor cores in the 5080 means more latency. The frames take longer to produce. 5080 versus 4090. So here's how that rolls out. DLSS 3x multi-frame gen on 5080 is the closest equivalent to DLSS 2x frame gen on RTX 4090, and it's actually delivering a 15% uplift to frame rate. However, looking at latency, that extra frame rate comes with a 9 millisecond lag penalty. 5080 with 4x MFG offers a 46% higher frame rate versus 2x frame gen on 4090, with the latency deficit increasing to around 11 milliseconds. So with that in mind, I can imagine the 5070 versus 4090 comparison that Nvidia has suggested being like this. I can well imagine that there will be frame rate parity, but latency will be a completely different story. Alan Wake 2 next, benched with the new Nvidia driver that quote-unquote dropped the day before embargo. This does iron out some stutter and also reduce latency in my tests by around 2 milliseconds on average. Still, a 14.25 frames per second average at native 4K with a 239 millisecond latency is obviously totally unplayable. By the time we've maxed out DLSS 4 with 4x MFG and DLSS performance mode super resolution on top, we're at 131 frames per second, practically a 9x frame rate boost, albeit with a heavy 93.9 millisecond latency average. Swapping in SuperRes metrics over native, frame rate hits the 3940 FPS average with a 71.7 millisecond latency average. That's rather high for what is a best case scenario for latency. The difference with 4x MFG turns out to be rather large, 22 milliseconds. This is very noticeable and basically means that these settings aren't really tenable. We're going to need to lower them or reduce resolution. By extension, 4090 comparisons aren't particularly great either. 5080 3x MFG beats 4090's 2x frame gen by around 15% in frame rate terms, which is nice, rising to 46% when we deploy 5080's 4x MFG, which is even nicer. Problem is that frame gen lag here on 4090 is 67.3 milliseconds, which feels heavy, but I guess it's okay for a slower paced game. 3x MFG on 5080 is incurring a 22.7 millisecond latency penalty versus 1490, rising to 26 milliseconds with 4x MFG. So, to cut a long story short, yes, you can achieve higher frame rates on 5080 with multi-frame gen versus 4090 at 2x frame gen. But 4090 is delivering tolerable latency for this kind of game, while for me, 5080 has crossed a threshold. Over 90 milliseconds latency with frame rates well north of 120 frames per second is creating a disconnect that doesn't feel right. My take on it is simple. Multi-frame generation can be great, but tailoring settings to get a good base latency number is required. It also puts into perspective the idea of a 40 to 60 FPS threshold as being acceptable for frame generation. Alan Wake 2 compared to Cyberpunk is proving to me that isn't really the number that we should be looking at. We need to be looking at having a good base latency before invoking frame generation. And here's the thing, right? As we've proven here, even with frame rates that are relatively similar, every game will have a different base latency. Right, let's summarize. First of all, let's speak about value. RTX 5080 is in a bit of a weird place. It is the best $1,000 GPU in terms of price versus performance. In fact, looking at dollars per frame based on MSRP, it tops the chart based on data from 17 different graphics cards. It's slower than 5090 and 4090, but proportionately, it offers a lot more value, and that's good, right? On the flip side, however, it's the best value $1,000 GPU because there is no other $1,000 GPU. There is no competition. Meanwhile, based on launch MSRPs, it's remarkable to see that even the 10 gig RTX 3080, which should have some results impacted by its 10 gigabytes of frame buffer memory, well, that's still coming in at number 2 behind the RTX 5080. And this kind of sums up how static value has been since the seismic launch of the 3080 back in 2020. I will say once again that obviously the cost of silicon isn't getting any cheaper, and we've also gone through an inflationary bubble. But even so, it's food for thought, right? Of course, the 5080 has unique charms. It has the VRAM and enough horsepower to make multi-frame generation technology very usable. But even then, on the most demanding titles, you can't just whack up everything to the max. Latency is noticeable if the controls still feel kind of muggy at DLSS super resolution settings. Frame generation is only going to add to that lag. And again, I think something worth pointing out is that multi-frame generation can produce great results, but it should not be considered a pure performance uplift. Put it this way, if a game feels unplayable to you, if the base frame rate is too low or the latency is too high, it'll still feel bad with multi-frame generation active. DLSS 4 can make a relatively smooth game look very smooth, but it can't turn an unplayable experience into a playable one. So I'm expecting relatively mediocre reviews on this one. It's the best GPU in its class, but the gap between an 80 and 90 class card is wider than ever, while gen-on-gen gains are variable, but never really transformative. I do like the new features though, and I get the feeling that the extra tensor core performance will prove its worth over time, especially against 30 series cards downwards. Anyway, that's the end of the review, so just time for the usual formalities, which is to say that liking / subscribing / sharing can be useful for Digital Foundry, as can ringing bells for notifications. But for us, it's all about the DF Supporter Program, where you can get high-quality video downloads of everything we do, early access to DF Direct, early access to a bunch of content actually, and access to our amazing community. Still, that's it from me for now. As always, thanks for watching and supporting Digital Foundry.